We've all been framed. You heard that right. Framed to fit within a box of our own making. We have had plenty of help forming the frames by which we see ourselves and our world. We've been framed by our upbringing, our past experiences, and the people we have been around. In fact, we frame ourselves and others every day in big ways and small. What if God were calling us to live outside of the box of our normal way of seeing things? What if we could frame our every problem into an opportunity by the power of God? What if we allowed our lives to become framed by God? Thanks for joining us as we explore what God has to say for us today in our series, Framed.
So as I think about this concept of framed and all that God wanted to say through me, I came to a point this week where I often come to this spot. Maybe you've been there before. Have you ever asked, why is everything so hard? Why is everything so hard? Seems like it's easy for other people, but it's hard for me. I mean, there's just dozens of things that I could point to. One of them that's like really real. You know, I expected to like be in a new house and here by now every day and moved, and it's crazy because everyone else's houses, especially the ones that I want to buy, they not only sell for what they ask, but way over asking. And my house is like, it's a brand new house. I put it for sale and it's like crickets. And I'm like, God, why is everything so hard? Why is, and it doesn't help that, did you know that we live in a society, in a culture where framed has become an art form? When I think about framing, it's basically creating a narrative that maybe is real or maybe isn't real, but it's possible that a lot of you have exited social media, right? I know a lot of you don't go on there anymore. You know how I know? Because when I post things on Facebook, I'm expecting them to be liked and shared from people that go to our church, and it's there I'm seeing crickets too. So I know a lot of you have quit going on social media, or you just don't like anything that gets posted. But social media is kind of a crazy thing. Maybe you have experienced it, but you feel like everybody else goes on really cool vacations all the time, right? And I never go anywhere. Or maybe you're one of the ones who are able to get those perfect shots of this thing that you created, and you're like, wow, they are so creative. I wish I could do something like that. Or the famous ones, now these aren't done as much as they used to be, but do you remember when the plates of food? Yeah. Like you've seen the thing all the time that someone was eating that made you think, well, at least I wish I could eat a meal but the way of framing life to make it look like, and some of the other ones they use, instead of pictures, they use words, and this person's so creative. I know that I've had a struggle posting much on Facebook because I'm not cool enough. Like, I don't think there's very few things in life where it was so exciting that I feel like, oh, I've got to share this with everybody. Everybody has to know this. Like, I remember back, it was maybe 2011 was the last thing that I really wanted to share. I was going down the Magnum at Cedar Point, which is one of the roller coasters. And I lost my cell phone out of my pocket. And a guy about 6 seats back, who also had his hands in the air, caught it. So that was something worth sharing, but most of us, we struggle in this world to frame our lives because, we don't want to look like everybody else's wow when we are meh. So I don't know if you're like me, but I struggle in this world where everything is framed, where everything looks perfect, where it feels like no one's maybe facing some of the stuff that I'm facing, or maybe everybody's facing stuff that's way worse than me. Why would I say something like my little problem when everybody else is wrestling against these really big, gigantic problems, and mine are not as important, not as relevant, not as worthy of being shared. And I ran across a guy named Mark Batterson. I follow him. He's a pastor in Washington. And I read an article that he wrote this week, or a devotional, not this week, it was actually a few weeks ago. And he was talking about this biosphere. And there's this biosphere, it's called Biosphere 2. It was built in 1987. It cost $150 million to build this. And just in case you're not aware, 1987 money was different than 2021 money. I mean, the sports teams now that are worth $1 billion, back then they were worth maybe $150 million. I'm just trying to give some context. A house, 1987, 50 to 75,000 would be 350 to 400,000 now. A car, which would have capped out around 20 grand. Now I was in a Dodge dealership getting my minivan fixed, and there was a $100,000 Ram on the lot. So if that gives you any idea on difference between 1987 money and 2021 money, this thing costed, and can I be honest, am I the only one who thinks it looks a little creepy? It looks a little creepy. So the idea was they were building this Biosphere 2. And the point for Biosphere 2 was they wanted to create a habitation. And inside that, there's a desert, and there's an ocean, and it's actually designed for scientists to live inside of for 2 years without ever leaving that habitat and having to grow their own food. And the reason that it's called Biosphere 2, interestingly, is that, do you know what Biosphere 1 is? You're living in it. You're living in it. It's called Earth. So they were trying to create this thing where they could create, how could we create life on another planet by building this perfect conditioned world? And they expected by, removing all pollution and creating this perfect world with perfect soil where nothing was ever wrong, that everything would grow and flourish, and we could have this utopian society inside of this biosphere. But early on, before the scientists even moved in, they ran into this problem. The trees would grow to a certain level and literally fall down under their own weight. So you would expect that this tree with no resistance would, grow to the moon, would, like every pine tree would become a redwood because it was in these perfect conditions. And the thing that they discovered was that what was missing inside the biosphere is they had to add wind and climate things, because the trees, it's as they face the wind, as they face the storms, as they face the harsh conditions that that our trees have to face, that's what causes their roots to go deep. That's what causes their bark to thicken. That's what causes them to become strong. And if I think about trees, and I think of the fact that, sometimes I think of God as a gardener, and we want this easy, smooth life where everything just kind of clicks, don't we? We're all happy when everything's running smooth, when everything's on time, and we actually pray those kind of prayers, don't we? Like, that's what we want God. We want, like, God to open up the closest parking spot at the best restaurant and on discount night, right? Yeah, we want everything to go smooth and easy. And here's the problem: is if you think the path of zero resistance is the best path for you, if you think, is there anybody else who wants the path of zero resistance? Is there anyone else who prays for the path of zero resistance? Come on, I'm not alone, right? But if you think the path of zero resistance is the best path for you, you have been framed. You have been framed because just like the trees, without adversity, we atrophy. My son had a broken leg. He's 9, the cast has been off for, I think months now. And he's still not back to where he was. He broke his tibia, and it causes atrophy. He's had to sit on the couch for 2.5 months waiting for that cast to come off. And when it came off, I'm going to say it, just don't tell on me, okay? When it came off, he literally cried because he was looking down at his little chicken leg. It was smaller than his other leg, and he's wondering, am I ever going to be normal again? But what happened was that leg had atrophied, and he had to go through months and months of physical therapy, and he was really happy to get his certificate of completion last week from physical therapy. He was like, hey, I got an award, I finished something, I'm happy. But more than that, he's happy that both of his legs look similar to the same size. But what happens in our lives is when everything is easy, when everything is zero resistance, when something comes at us, we're not ready to handle it. And as parents, as a church, as a society, we try to make everybody in a biosphere, right? We try to make everything as easy as possible for everyone. Make everyone as comfortable as possible. Make as zero resistance as possible. And we think that it's for everyone's good, but I'm just wondering. That's why Pastor John will always, if you get into conversations with me, I'm always going to challenge you to dream. And I love when you dream bigger than me. I love when you can actually stretch my thinking. I was just talking to David back there about that earlier before the service started. He's got a God-sized idea. It's even bigger than I can comprehend. And I love it when someone's stretching me. I love it because I know that God's stretching them. And here's the importance of having a God-sized dream and a God-sized goal is that the goal of pursuing God-sized dreams is not about a destination, but the person you are becoming on the journey. Right? It's not about, I'm going to get to this dream and then my life is going to be a life of zero resistance. That I'm going to get to this dream and then everything's going to be perfect, or that everything's going to be, a bed of roses. My bed of roses always has some thorns. I don't know about yours. But we're becoming somebody different along the journey. We're growing as people. We're growing spiritually. We're growing closer to God. And if we're doing life right, we're growing closer to one another and rising up together in this journey we call life. And as I think about how this relates to God, this series framed, we're talking about the life of this guy named David. And David is super famous person, probably maybe the third most famous person in the Bible. Arguably, he's definitely top 5, but he was one of the kings of Israel. And the reason he's famous is because he got in a fight with a giant named... Yeah, everybody knows this story. You could have never been to church and you know the story of David and Goliath, right? You could have watched a football game. You could have been to a business meeting. You could have been to some things that have nothing to do with God or church, and they'll talk about David and Goliath. And we're at that story. Last week we talked about the fact that Saul was the king of Israel, but God had anointed David when he was a teenager to become the king of Israel. And this is not long after that We're going to pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 1, and let's kind of read this. The Philistines now mustered their army for battle and camped between Soka in Judah and Azekah at Ephes-dammim. Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. And so the Philistines and Israelites faced each other on opposite hills, with the valley between them. I'm a visual thinker, so I like to pull up a picture, and I like you to think about what's going on here. So they didn't do battle in the old days like they do now. You know, now we got tanks, and we got planes, and we've got guns, and we've got bombs and missiles, and all. They didn't have none of that. These guys had, if they were lucky, they had a sword. If they were lucky, there was actually one sword in the entire army of Israel, and it belonged to King Saul. But if they didn't have swords, they had arrows, they had spears, they had very primitive weapons. And one of the big things they used to defend themselves was the landscape. You see, because you could be on top of one of those hills, and if that other army had to approach you by coming up the hill, gravity was on your side. You know, you could sling some boulders, you could sling some arrows. The spears went further downhill than they did uphill. You could stop an army if you could take that hill. And you had the Philistines on one hill, and you had the armies of Israel on another hill, and they're basically saying, you can't come my way and I can't go your way, and they're fighting over the territory. And then our villain enters the story. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. Over 9 feet tall. And I want you to know that in those days, Saul was the tallest person. He said it was head and shoulders above everybody in Israel. And he topped out probably under 6 feet tall. And this giant named Goliath from Gath is over 9 feet tall. And if that weren't bad enough, Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you all coming out to fight?" he called. "I am the Philistine champion, but you are only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." So you got this giant he's looking at a bunch of little people and trying to pick a fight. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man. Send me a man who will fight. Isn't there a man among you? Isn't there a man who's willing to stand up and fight? Isn't there anybody with anybody who thinks they're strong? Let's read this one. When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. Now you may wonder why I got that word Saul highlighted and underlined. So here's the deal. In that culture, when the challenge was put out, ultimately, whose responsibility was it to take on that champion? Saul. I already told you, he's head and shoulders above everybody in Israel. And everybody in Israel is looking at their leader Saul, who is terrified. And they're like, if Saul isn't going to go take on this guy, how long is it before we have to worry about the families that we're protecting? the homes that we're protecting, the livestock we're protecting, the crops we spent all spring planting that is going to be our food for the winter. What's going to happen when they topple us over and take everything we have? Because there's no way we can stand up against this giant. Everything's been deeply shaken. And I think our lives get like that sometimes. Things happen sometimes that deeply shake us, don't they? Maybe you lost someone. Maybe you've had to struggle through wondering if someone is going to make it. Maybe they did. Maybe you look at our world today and you see, God, what is happening? It seems like if it weren't for bad news, would there be any news at all? It seems deeply shaken. And for 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. Strutted, taunting. And the things we face, I sometimes feel like the enemy is doing that to us. It feels like that sometimes in our family. I could talk about a whole lot more stuff that I'm facing, but I'm going to leave it for a different time, a different day. And all the time, we see it as these are our problems. These are the things we can't overcome. These are the things that are hurting us. But rarely do we ever gain the perspective that these are the storms that come in our lives to make our roots grow deep and our spirits strong. That as we have nothing else to do but to cling to God, that we grow deeper in Him. That is, when we're all out of answers, we finally look to the one who is the answer. And one day, Jesse, you remember that was David's father's name. One day Jesse said to David, "Take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers." So David's brothers were part of the Israeli army, but David was still a little too young to be a part of that army. But David's dad said, "Take your brothers some food." And so David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts, as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. And soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army, and they're standing, they're both on top of that hill again. And there's that valley that's in between. And they run into this same scene. We're going to look and act tough when really we're afraid. And David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks, to the ranks to greet his brothers. And as he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. Then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. And as soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. "Have you seen the giant?" the men asked. "He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes." That's a pretty cool reward. So you'll be part of the royal family, and your whole family won't have to pay taxes anymore. So David wanted to clarify, right? David asked the soldiers standing by, what will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? David wanted to know what the reward was. And I think that there's something that maybe don't relate to this, but it might relate to something you're going through, so I wanted to include it in this message. Let's read this out loud. Before you go into battle, ask, what is the reward? What is the reward? So even if you win this fight, even if you win this argument, even if you're right and they're wrong, every married couple say, he's talking to me. Every parent say, he's talking to me. Everyone who has a parent say, he's talking to me. Before you go into battle, ask, what is the reward? You see, so many times we end up in fights and arguments that cause hindrances in our relationship. And even if we win, what do we win? The prize is nothing. So someone thinks we're right. Whoop-de-doo. I was right. What does that gain me? Ain't nothing like the prize David was offered if he won that fight, right? So this becomes, maybe because I already said some of you have checked out of the whole social media world, but the social media world is like dynamite on this stuff. If you look at all of these things and you start having battles on social media, I mean, it just gets uglier and uglier multiplied. Like, don't ever talk about what you're arguing with your family about with your fingers in social media. You just shouldn't do it. It makes everything worse very, very fast. Right? And there's some arguments, I should have pulled it up. I seen this thing on Facebook where, people are arguing politics on Facebook. And it's like the percentage of people that get mad is 100%. And the percentage of people who change their mind is 0%. So what are we really going to win? You'd be better off, instead of having that argument on Facebook, to maybe say, hey, can we go get coffee? And actually have a face-to-face discussion and maybe say from the heart, here's some things I've seen. And here's where I'm at. And maybe being open to hear and open to talk, if it's really that important to you. If you really think by winning that battle, you're going to, change the world. There are hills to die on. There are hills to die on when you're talking about something that's going to affect someone's eternity. That's going to affect somebody's relationship with Christ. Those are the ones that, again, we don't want to have that conversation on social media. But we want to try to have those hard conversations. We don't want to avoid confrontation. I read somewhere, actually, avoiding confrontation is actually a form of lying. Let that sink in for a second. Avoiding confrontation is actually a form of lying. Maybe we agree, maybe we disagree, but actually we'll both grow deeper by having the conversation, especially if you can do it in a civil manner without losing your temper. But if you don't choose your battles in life, you will find yourself framed. You'll find yourself framed. And that one was for free. But David, when he heard what the prize was, then he's like, who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God? And these men gave David the same reply, and they said, yes, that is the reward for killing him. But when David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, he was angry. What are you doing around here anyway? He demanded. Maybe you were here last week, maybe you don't, maybe you weren't, so I'm just going to recap that David was a shepherd of sheep, and he knew what it was like to be the black sheep of his family. If you read Psalm 69, it's a psalm of David. David talks about how he was estranged from his own family. He was always the one on the outside looking in. It was probably because he didn't look like all the other sons of Jesse. And there could be some debate about why that is, but either way, he was ostracized. He was always shunned by his brothers, and here he is once again. He's starting to grow up. The pictures that you've seen as a 9-year-old David with a sling are actually not accurate. That they just did that in Bible school with the little felt things, and that wasn't really accurate. David was probably around 20 at this time, at least around 17. According to Bible scholars, obviously I wasn't there either. But it makes more sense. But here's David. He's trying to grow up. He's trying to be a man. He's trying to, do what God's calling him to do and not get caught up in all of his family drama. And he shows up on the battlefield, and his oldest brother has nothing to do. What are you doing around here anyway? Let's read that yellow part. What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? What's he really saying? What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? Dad only gave you one job to take care of some sheep, and you still got a small flock. You can't even do that right. What are you doing out here with the army? This is where the big men are, who are afraid of the giant. I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle. What's David's brother doing here? He's trying to make David feel small, right? You ever have anybody try to make you feel small? Hurts, don't it? I like to think of it this way. When people try to make you feel small, it's a good sign that God is up to something big in your life. Let's say that out loud. When people try to make you feel small, it's a good sign that God is up to something big in your life. I've had a lot of attacks in my life from people that tried to make me feel small. But if I were to be really, really honest, do you know who the biggest offender is? The person who tries to make me feel small more than any other person in my life. Me. Negative self-talk. John, you can't do that. John, you messed up back there. John, you can't take that back. John. Anybody else ever struggle with some negative self-talk that you try to make yourself feel small? And I would say that is also true, that God is wanting to do something big in your life. That God is wanting to cause you to dream further than you can even imagine. That God is trying to stretch you, and you're trying to talk yourself out of what God's trying to talk you into by making yourself feel small. And maybe the voices, when they come from other people, the reason they hurt so much is because sometimes they're affirming what we already have been thinking about ourselves. And then we become defensive. And we get in an argument that maybe we can't, I was going to say an argument we can't win. But what does it even matter if we win? Maybe it's an argument we just shouldn't have. And then the story gets interesting. Then David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. Don't worry about this Philistine, David told Saul. I'll go fight him. Now, Saul's the king of Israel. He's bigger than David. He's stronger than David. Sometimes men who are big and strong get kind of full of pride, and I'm thinking Saul might have been thinking, who is this punk kid? I mean, yeah, sure, he's 17, 18, 19, maybe 20. But still, who is this punk kid? He's not even a part of my army. He hasn't even been trained. And he says, I'll go fight him. Don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy. And he's been a man of war since his youth. And here's Saul doing the same thing that David's brother did, right? He's trying to make David feel small. Trying to discount what God's calling David to do. He's trying to make David feel small. You're only a boy. And maybe you could say, I can't do that. I'm only, come on, whatever it is I'm only a whatever. I'm only from Webberville. I only got $5 in my pocket. I only, whatever it is. You're only a boy. But David persisted. This is the whole key to this message. Stuff that's been happening in your life, you think it's been meant for your harm. But really, it's been meant to make you stronger, to make your roots grow deeper, to cause you to get closer to God, to cause you to have other people that come around you. You notice trees that grow high, they often grow in groups, right? It's because a group of trees can take more storms than one tree standing alone, and we're no different. But those things that are coming at us, those things we had to face, we think they were meant to kill us. We think they were meant to hurt us. We think they were meant to take us down. And there's an old phrase, whatever don't kill me makes me stronger. And there's a lot of truth in that. See, David persisted. I have been taking care of my father's sheep and goats. And he said, when a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club, and I rescue the lamb from its mouth. And if the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. David is killing lions and bears with not much more than his bare hands. He may be young, but he ain't no punk. He's been through some stuff. That whole thing of being estranged from his family, it left him out all alone to the place where he didn't have anybody when that lion or that bear showed up. But do you know who he had? He had God. He had God. His roots were going deeper. See, God was preparing him. I told you that when God puts a God-sized dream inside of you, it's more about who you are becoming than the destination that you're heading to. David says, I have done this to both. I want you to get the S. Do you guys remember from English class what S means? It's plural, right? I always thought David got one lion and one bear. That would have been enough for a lifetime for me. How about you? But no, he says lions and bears. And I'll do the same to this pagan Philistine too. For he has defied the armies of the living God. Catch a couple things there. David is full of faith, not because David thinks he's tough because he killed a lion or a bear, but he thinks this Philistine is weak because he has defied the armies of the living God. And the Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. Let's read that out loud. This is so important. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. Saul finally consented. All right, go ahead, he said. Now I want you to remember what the giant said with his taunts. He said, if I kill your guy, you become our slaves. If you kill me, we'll become your slaves. Why is Saul willing to bet their families, their livestock, their crops, their lands, their homes, and even their own lives on the words of this punk kid? I'm dating myself. You guys remember that? Please be kind. Rewind. You see, there was something that happened in between the time that Samuel anointed David, the king of Israel, and the time when David is having this conversation with Saul. There's something very important that happened in the middle. You see, this isn't the first time that Saul has met this punk kid. There's a weird verse in Samuel 16, and it says that after David had been anointed king, that God, that's what it says, it's weird, that God sent an evil spirit to torment Saul. And that the only way that Saul could get relief from this evil spirit that would torment him is there was this kid who tended sheep out in the wilderness, who knew how to play a harp. And every time David would play the music, he was so close to God that the evil spirit had to flee. And this is the kid that's standing in front of Saul and saying, "The Lord who rescued me." See, he didn't, at that point, Saul was no longer looking at David's strength or David's stature, but remembering David's relationship with the Lord. And maybe Saul had in his mind that if God could deliver me, maybe He'll deliver this giant into his hand too. So I'm going to close. I'm going to wrap this whole thing up. And I know I'm killing you, right? You're going to have to wait till next week to find the fight. But I want to end with this question. If David was a teenager when he was anointed king, why did he have to wait till he was 30 to wear a crown? Anybody? So he was a teenager. Samuel anoints him king. And it says he doesn't become king. He doesn't have the office until he's 30. Why? I always wondered that, especially when I was a teenager and I felt like God was calling me. I always wondered, why did David have to wait? God already said he's the king. Why can't he just walk into Saul's office and say, "Dude, you're out"? Bang! He was not ready. You see, he was still being framed. He was still being framed by God. He was still being framed by God. And maybe there's something you've been waiting a long time on. Maybe you got a journey that you're on. Maybe you're wondering, how long is it going to be before I get there, Lord? Maybe you're trying to lead a family forward, a church forward, a business forward. Whatever you're trying to lead forward, and you're wondering why I haven't been able to get to where I'm at faster. Why has it been so hard? Maybe, just maybe, God's still working on you. Maybe God's still getting you ready. Maybe God's going to use you to cause another generation to be able to conquer the thing that you weren't able to conquer. And He's saying, I need you to invest into this next generation with your time and resources and heart and whatever it is that you have. Maybe when we're ready, God's going to put us in that spot. What if God is framing you for something bigger? What if God is trying to stretch you beyond the thinking that you've had before? What if God is calling you outside of the box? That's next week's message, by the way. But we're stuck saying, why is everything so hard? Why is everything so hard? Whining and complain about this, complain about that. Is it hard? Absolutely, it's hard. I don't discount. I don't discount that whatever you're going through is possibly the biggest thing you ever faced in your life. It is hard. But please be kind and rewind. And remember, you might be facing Goliath right now. But there's been some lions and some bears that God delivered to you in your past. There was some things that maybe you didn't think you could get rid of. Maybe some things you didn't think you could get through. Some things you didn't think were ever going to end, but somehow, you know what? God showed up there. God answered that prayer. God brought me out of that. Whoo, I'm glad God didn't let me go over there. Rewind. Think about it. Think about the adversity in your life and how God has used it to cause you to grow deeper into it. See, when we judge our lives through the frame of our pain, we end God's story before He finishes the book. When we judge our lives through the frame of our pain, we end God's story before He finishes the book. Yeah, you're going through some stuff, but God's still writing the book. There's still more story to be told. And here's the deal with David. Did you know Goliath wasn't David's Goliath? And when I say that, I mean Goliath wasn't the biggest thing David would ever face in his life. That's the story we hear all the time. It works really well in Sunday school. But Goliath wasn't David's Goliath because the giants he faced after that day became bigger and badder than Goliath. So as we're talking about being framed by God, I just want us to enter into a time of prayer. And I want you to think of whatever adversity you're going through right now. And be able to say with the hymnist, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. God, I know you're using it to make me strong. Heavenly Father, we come before you in the name of Jesus, and we believe, Lord, that you are framing us. That you are making us into so much more than we ever imagined we could be. God, I pray that across this room that you would still begin planting God-sized dreams in the hearts of your people. Dreams to reach a lost generation, dreams to reach a lost family or friend in their lives. Dreams to see your kingdom furthered in big ways. And God, I pray that you would show us the small steps that we need to take right now, today. That as we pray, we would know that whatever we're going through is something that you're going to use for our good. Even when we can't see it. Even when what we're looking at doesn't look good, you're still working it for our good. Because it is you who is framing our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.